Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting of the Subcommittee on Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, the Office of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy to order. Thank you all for joining us. I will ask Mr. Scott to take attendance.
Chair Hood.
Present.
Representative McKinney.
Here.
Representative Brabeck.
Here.
Representative Weiss.
Here.
Representative Martis.
Here.
Representative Beeson.
Here.
Representative Cavett.
Here.
Representative Schutte.
Here.
Madam Chair, all members of the subcommittee are present.
I love that attendance record. Thank you. We will hear today from the House Fiscal Agency a presentation on the proposed budget for the fiscal year 24-25 for the Eagle Department. And Austin, if you'd like to take the mic and run us through that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Austin Scott, fiscal analyst with the House Fiscal Agency. As the chair mentioned, this afternoon I'm going to be speaking to the 2024-25 executive recommended budget for the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. This portion of the larger executive budget was issued earlier this month. Excuse me. And we'll dig into some of those specifics that will echo some of the information and comments that you heard from the department last week. I want to pause for a moment and remind everyone that we in the House Fiscal Agency are here to help all of the members of the Michigan House of Representatives, regardless of party. We work with the majority side, we work with the minority side, we work with folks of all parties to help develop the budget, to look at the fiscal impacts of proposed legislation, to forecast revenues. We have folks that do that in our agency as well, so we're available to help, generally speaking, all 110 districts and those that represent all the constituents across the state. Specifically with regard to this subcommittee, work with this subcommittee to help develop a subcommittee version of Eagle's budget for next fiscal year, which will begin the first day of October later this calendar year. That budget bill, as was the case last year with everyone here present familiar, will then move on to committee consideration by the House, and there's a parallel process going on in the Senate. Looking at the summary that I provided for members of the subcommittee and folks that have joined us behind me as well, I'm going to take a look at this and make reference to it. So thanks to the chair for allowing me to speak, and at her discretion, I'm happy to field questions and sort of have a conversation about specifics in the summary here and in the budget in general for next fiscal year. I want to first take a look at the chart at the top of the page. You're familiar with this. I understand each of the legislators on our subcommittee serve on other subcommittees, so I know you're familiar with the format. I know you're familiar with appropriations and are well-versed in our process. So this format certainly looks familiar to you. I want to call your attention to a couple of items at the top chart here before moving on to some specifics that are unique for Eagle. You'll see, as we heard last week, the enacted budget for the fiscal year that we're in right now, which runs through the end of September, is about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion. And what's being proposed for next fiscal year is $1.1 billion. I'm looking at gross. But something I want to emphasize that's not readily apparent here is Eagle, along with other departments, have received a supplemental appropriation for the current fiscal year. In the case of Eagle, it was $102 million. So I want to emphasize that this enacted column is as enacted as the fiscal year began the 1st of October. After that 1st of October, there are a number of departments, Eagle being one of them, that received a supplemental appropriation. In the case of Eagle, it was $102 million. It was enacted in Public Act 321 of 2023. So I want to call that to your attention. That $102 million was split between $55 million federal and $47 million of general fund. So if you're looking to get a snapshot of where Eagle stands at this hour for this current fiscal year, it is a little over $1.1 billion. As enacted, it was 1.05, so that's the discrepancy there. A specific point I want to make about that supplemental appropriation, it included $55 million in federal funding for the Healthy Hydration Program. There are connections to the Healthy Hydration Program in what's being proposed for next year that I'll touch on as well. But I do want to draw that line between the bulk of that $50 million federal funding going into law for the current year, and you'll see, again, a connection to that in what's being proposed for next year. So that's something to bear in mind. The other item I want to call your attention to at the top here, before we move on to some of the specific numbered items, is the FTE number. Is what's being requested for next fiscal year is the increase or the addition of 88 FTE positions. That supplemental appropriation included 3. So if you see 85 versus 88, that's where the discrepancy comes from. So I want to be clear about that as well. As enacted, FTE positions were at 1616. As requested for next year, it's 1704, but there was an additional 3 FTE positions attached to that supplemental funding that went into effect after October 1st from last fall. All right, excuse me. Digging into some of the specifics, I'm going to take some of these in groups and begin with item number 1. Last week we heard about a fee increase to the landfill tipping fee, which would go to support the Renew Michigan program. I do want to emphasize that point. You have heard a good deal and will continue to hear a good deal of discussion about a proposed increase in the landfill tipping fee. I do want to be specific that as is proposed in the executive budget, it is being requested to go into the Renew Michigan program. The Renew Michigan program has a few different statutory uses that are sketched out and written into law, and they're listed there: environmental remediation, brownfield development, recycling programs, solid waste management. Those are the existing purposes for the Renew Michigan program. The increase in the landfill tipping fee would support those statutory purposes. The other item I want to emphasize is if the legislature does support the fee increase, hypothetically speaking, and it's put into law as is being proposed, there will still be additional legislation needed to accompany this fee increase. So just placing the spending authority in the budget doesn't automatically change the rate of the fee we're talking about. There would need to be companion legislation for the department, Eagle in this case, to be able to take advantage of that fee increase. You'll see listed there in the description, the landfill tipping fee as proposed would increase from 36 cents per ton to $5 per ton. It was last increased on the 21st of September 2011, and it was increased from 7 cents up to the current 12 cents per cubic yard. So it wasn't quite doubled. I don't want to confuse everyone with too many sort of specific metric versus non-metric measurements. But generally speaking, it's been about 13 years since the fee was increased. It was proposed to increase for fiscal year 2018. That proposal did not ultimately go into law. And again, we're seeing a proposal for an increase again for next fiscal year. I do want to emphasize that the landfill tipping fee increase is proposed to generate, as is proposed, would generate a projection of about $80 million in new revenue, and that's all restricted funding, and this is unique to Eagle. This is not general funds. I think it's important to make that clear as well. Moving on to the next 3 as a group, item numbers 2, 3, and 4 are all general fund. That's one thing they have in common. 2, they're also being requested as work projects. As a quick refresher, when an appropriation has work project designation, that means that whichever department or agency is expending it, in this case Eagle, but there are work projects in other departments as well, they have additional years to spend that appropriation. Typically, appropriations are good for a 12-month cycle, starting in October, going through the following September. In the case of each of these three appropriations, item numbers 2, 3, and 4, the GF is being requested as a work project, which would give it a few more years beyond just the end of September 2025 to be expended. I do want to touch on item number 2. There is general fund match. This is essentially general fund match in the current year for a similar purpose, water infrastructure projects. So in that regard, there is precedent for GF match being appropriated for water infrastructure projects. The next two items, numbers 3 and 4, there is less of a straight line to draw between what's in current law and what's being proposed for next year. These are comparatively speaking newer initiatives or newer programs that were addressed last week. Similar purpose, though they do have some differences as well. Item number 3, clean fuel and charging infrastructure, you see is for electric vehicle charging stations, hydrogen fueling facilities. And item number 4 is essentially grant funding for those that operate motor fleets. And when I say those, I'm referring to local governments or transit authorities, universities, colleges, airports that may have their own fleet of gas vehicles, internal combustion vehicles. And this funding, if enacted, would allow those entities to apply for funding to replace their existing fleet. I want to skip down to item number 6, stormwater grants. There is both one-time and ongoing funding for projects that would mitigate climate change that are stormwater-related projects, and it's the boilerplate that gives specifics. Boilerplate that's proposed gives specifics on this program for funding available to local governments. The one-time portion of the stormwater grants, so that's 10 million GF, that's also requested to be work projected. If I can use work project as a verb, which it's not. So item numbers 2, 3, 4, and the one-time portion of 6 are all requested to extend the spending authority to extend beyond the end of this fiscal year. All right, flipping over, looking at the top of the second page there, we heard a bit about permitting last week and funding being requested to increase staff and their outreach for various permitting functions across the department. Here I want to emphasize that this funding, as is requested in the executive recommendation, would cross divisions. So this funding would be, as proposed, would apply towards permitting in different areas, in water resources, in air quality programs, remediation redevelopment functions, drinking water, environmental health, some of those different areas that you see in the budget, you see in the departmental's organizational structure, you see in their different daily operations even. So I want to emphasize that this permitting funding, as is being requested, would cross divisions, would cross different functions across the department and not be focused in just a single area. Moving on down to item number 9, this is what I echoed previously. There are 3 FTE positions and the funding to support those positions. You see there 450,300 GF to support the Healthy Hydration Program. And again, for those that are perhaps less familiar with Healthy Hydration, it's a program to support, as is noted there, the acquisition of drinking water filtration devices in schools and child care centers located in areas of need. So this request for staff would go along with that supplemental appropriation in the current year that I made reference to at the outset. Another item I'll touch on before closing out part 1 and moving on to boilerplate. Item number 10, environmental investigations, which is a law enforcement section, a law enforcement operation within Eagle. We heard last week that about the FTE positions that are functioning in the environmental investigation section that are conservation officers, and a request for additional GF funding. You see there $384,000 to support increased compensation for those folks. There is funding in the current year for increased compensation for conservation officers in the Department of Natural Resources. This funding is requested to take effect, of course, next fiscal year in October, but it is similar in the spirit or the intention of the increase. And again, these conservation officers in DNR for the current year, what's being requested for Eagle for next fiscal year, would go towards increasing the compensation for law enforcement that would approach other state law enforcement agencies, state police being one example. So when you see this request related to conservation officers in Eagle, I think it's reasonable to think about the wider compensation for law enforcement personnel in other state departments, because there are, of course, different law enforcement personnel in more than just the Department of State Police. We have some others, other staff as well. You'll see there towards the bottom the removal of one-time appropriations. That's a good, quick bulleted list reminder of some of the projects that are in the current year, some of the one-time projects that are in current year. Each of those are, of course, taken out as one-time projects when looking at next fiscal year. And flip over with me, please, to page 3, and we'll move on to discussing boilerplate. A general note about boilerplate. Boilerplate is part 2 of a budget, and the line items, of course, are part 1. There are a number of boilerplate sections that appear in most or sometimes all budgets on an annual basis. As a quick reference, looking at sections 207 on down the page towards or through 225, none of those sections are unique to Eagle. Those sections appear in other budgets as well. So I want to emphasize that I've included their revision or their deletion, whatever the change may be with regard to Eagle specifically, but I do want to emphasize that while we're discussing Eagle here this afternoon, these sections are not specific or unique to Eagle. The same goes for section 245 as well. And flipping over, a few concluding comments before yielding back to Chair Hood. Please look with me on page 4. I want to call your attention on page 4 to sections 902. Municipal assistance is an appropriation to which this section applies. And section 1001, the new section 1001. Both of these are specific to what I've characterized as stormwater grants. So you see some of the specific dynamics, requirements, provisions, as is being requested in the executive budget, and some of the distribution requirements. You see noted there at least 40% of these grants would be awarded to communities located within environmental justice, overburdened, or significantly overburdened communities. And we do have a concrete definition of that. We discussed it in the subcommittee last year, and that still is in place to make reference to. And then I'm going to conclude by making reference to, again, some of the work project sections, the new sections 1002, 1003, 1004. Each of those are sections that are designating those newly requested one-time appropriations as work projects that would carry forward into subsequent fiscal years. The spending authority for those appropriations would carry forward into subsequent fiscal years. So there is a straight line between the new sections 1001, 2, 3, and 4 to the 4 one-time appropriations, general fund one-time appropriations that are being requested for next fiscal year. Again, this subcommittee will consider this executive budget and continue to do so at the chair's discretion going forward for the next few weeks. As was the case last calendar year, we'll have a subcommittee version to be voted on, and then we'll move through the process here in the House. We have the same thing going on in the Senate, and the two sides will come together as the calendar progresses. But I want to echo what the chair has mentioned. This is at the outset, beginning this month in February, moving on into March, considering next fiscal year. And I'm happy to take questions at the chair's discretion.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, for your great work. Mr. Representative Schutte has a question.
Thank you, Chair Hood, and thank you, Mr. Scott, for the presentation as always, and your professionalism and verb use is always on point, so appreciate that. I was just wondering from the House Fiscal Agency perspective, and if you've done any analysis or estimates on how much the tipping fee increase will be borne by local school districts. I know, for example, in my district, local public schools are one of the largest users of our landfills. And if we're going to do some dynamic scoring, I would imagine universal free breakfast and lunch expansion would just create even more waste for those landfills.
There isn't a specific item that I can hand to you and say, this is what I would project or this is what I would estimate. I will make related comments to say that it is the case that the landfill tipping fee increase would increase funding for the purposes that are listed in statute, especially if it does indeed go to the Renew Michigan program as is projected or as is requested. There are a certain number of facilities to which this would apply. I remember looking back, doing research on a proposed landfill tipping fee increase 6 years ago in 2018, and sort of projecting what facilities in different areas of the state this may affect in terms of the solid waste facilities that we had at that time. But the direct answer to your question is no, that is not something that has yet been done, but we certainly can take a look and see what we could sort of evaluate and project going forward.
I imagine that sort of analysis would be useful to my colleagues.
Sure.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative Brayback?
Thanks so much, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Scott. I really appreciate it. I have a question for you on the one-time funding that is being removed. And I know that this is something that we always keep an eye on as we allocate one-time funds, of wondering about the implications in subsequent years. And when I was looking through the list, there are some for data collection or research, and those seem to, and maybe I'm categorizing things incorrectly, things that could be helpful for ongoing. Some things seemed like, oh, that makes sense, like for one time. Do you have a sense of, and maybe this is a question for later, but do you have a sense of the implications of those in terms of the one-time funding, particularly for the ones where it would be helpful to have either continued data or research?
Yeah, the first thing I think of is it's not uncommon for one-time appropriations to receive work project status, which is different than being built into what you'll hear called a base budget or a year-over-year ongoing budget. But it does give some additional life to what otherwise would be a 12-month cycle on a specific program or specific funding. Our agency produces in the fall, October, November, a report or an update on work projects, where they're at, they being work projects for each department, what spending authority is still available, what spending authority has been exhausted, which is written into statute, which is being requested for a new work project. And I have that for this group and can certainly pass that along to everyone, no trouble. But generally speaking, the appropriations that, in this case, Eagle, but presumably other departments as well, either prefer or require ongoing appropriation authority for, because there may not be enough time to expend that level of funding. It's not uncommon that those appropriations would be requested to receive work project status that allows them to move forward for 4 years. So that's sort of some general backgrounds and general notes. So there are appropriations that have that designation, and I can certainly pass along that updated report to everyone, no problem. And that will give an idea of which of these are which of these one-time appropriations actually continue to have life, even though they don't appear in the executive recommendation for next year.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, of course, thank you. I would note that a couple of those items, particularly the contaminated site remediation and redevelopment and environmental justice contaminated site cleanup, some of that work may continue through the ongoing sheets funding that has been purposed for that. And, you know, I imagine that will be done periodically through the budget as the sheets account changes. And of course, during COVID, we saw that spike up, so we were able to do those big investments. We'll continue to watch that as we move forward. And then others are more, I guess, you could say purely one-time spends that wouldn't need to be reinvested in. And then yet some more somewhere in between. So, yeah, thank you. All right, I believe that the minority vice chair had a question. Rep. Beeson?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair. Hey, my question was on the one-time spending. I think we went through the budget, and I think you during the off-season. And how many one-time current year work projects are out there right now from this budget? Can you give us that?
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yes, this is related to Representative Brayback's question.
Right.
Yes, it'll all be right there in chart form, certainly.
Okay, and just one more quick question. The other thing is the stuff that was kind of deleted, like the permitting report. I asked about permits last time because we've had some people that have been out 2-3 years for permitting, and we're going to delete the actual reporting of the permitting. Is that something that you've done in the past? You've been here a long time, a lot longer than me. Is that something that we continue to do in departments to get rid of the stuff that we can use as legislators to understand where everything is going?
The short answer to your question is yes, it's happened before. Yes, that type of deletion has happened before in Eagle. Yes, that type of deletion has happened before in other departments as well. It's also the case that the legislature hasn't always supported that deletion, and ultimately, when we look at the finished product going into law the first day of October, a reporting requirement or permitting reporting requirement does indeed make its way through and does remain in current law. So short answer is, has it happened before? Yes, it's happened before. Is it unique to Eagle? No. There are other departments where that's the case as well. Why is it being deleted from the executive budget? That I would yield to my friends from the executive branch for an answer to.
Thank you.
Do have a question, and it may require Travis to join you, Austin. On the Clean Fleets appropriation for $20 million, do we have a sense of the project size, minimum, maximum project size at this point, or still working on program design? Okay, still working on program design. Great. Any other questions? Okay. We do need to approve the minutes from the previous meeting. Representative Martis so moves. All in favor? Minutes approved. And then I believe that we are about ready to adjourn. So thank you all for your time and joining us, and we'll look forward to our next meeting.